Well, I had the opportunity to meet the 6 of them about a half hour ago. We got our photograph taken, and the research they did in that short time about me was that the president has no idea what's going on in his life. Because I said, good luck to all of you, bye-bye, and went to the elevator, everybody stood in the room, watched me go down, waved, and got back to my office, and they said, you weren't supposed to leave. So I said, okay, I'm back again. But, and I also asked all 6 of them to explain what they were doing in less than 2 minutes, and they did. And then they said they only have 10 minutes to describe their work, and that wasn't long enough. But I'll tell you, they told me in 2 minutes what they're doing, and I was very impressed with all 6 of you, what the work you're doing, the kinds of things you're interested in. It's so different. When I was a student, not too long ago, many moons ago, undergraduates really didn't get too involved in research. You know, it was the kind of thing that you just did your classes and you went on, and research was something that was destined for master's degrees and PhDs, and you know, once you got out of the undergraduate level. So I'm extremely impressed that we have undergraduates that get so invested in investigating things, investigating various topics and all across the board here. But that you really participate in furthering knowledge. And it's not just taking in knowledge, but that you are giving knowledge back, and you are really helping other people to see things and see our world in a very different way. And that is really what's most impressive about it. So I encourage the 6 of you not to end here, to keep going with it, and keep using your abilities and your intellect to continue to add to the field of knowledge that we have. Now, I really am leaving now, so, because I do have somewhere else to go. Can I go now? Are you going to watch me go down the elevator and then call me and say you're about to be back here again? So congratulations to all of you. Thank you for putting up with me this morning and all my shenanigans, and I wish all of you well. How many of you are seniors? Well, good luck. Good luck. You've got a couple more weeks left. And then the world will open its doors. And you will open the world to you. So thank you very much, and congratulations to all of you. And here I go.
Thank you, Father Peter. I'd like to now invite faculty mentor, Dr. Whitney Martin, to introduce our first Falvey Scholar of the Day.
Great, well, welcome all. I'm excited to kick this off this morning by introducing Jubilee Marshall. Jubilee is a history major with concentration in peace and justice studies. She also has minors in political science and economics. So I felt so privileged to work with her on this project, which is entitled Public Health and Urban Space in Philadelphia's Black Burial Grounds, 1750 to 1850. I'll just say that it started as a junior research project, so this has been something that's been in the works now and ongoing for several semesters. This research was supported by a VERF grant, a Villanova University Research Fellowship from the CRF. And one notable thing I'll say about this research project is that this academic year, Jubilee has had the opportunity to present this project at both the annual meeting of the American Historical Association, which met in Chicago in January, I believe, and also at the Organization of American Historians annual meeting, which met in Philadelphia in April. So presenting at both of those conferences is a phenomenal accomplishment for academic historians, and for an undergraduate is just even more phenomenal. So congratulations, Jubilee. We look forward to hearing your presentation. Let's see. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and to Dr. Martinko for introducing me. My project examines Black burial sites in Philadelphia from 1750 to 1850. And I have sort of two main arguments. The first is that these sites functioned as key areas of racial contestation in the early period of this sort of broad century I'm examining, and that by vying for control of bodies and of space in these sites, the Black community sought to intervene in broader conversations of public health, and in doing so, they attempted to gain control of the physical area of these sites so as to provide for the public health needs of their community and create the conditions for the formation of Black churches in the 1790s. In the pre-1792 period, Black residents of Philadelphia were participating in white churches as congregants, as they received baptism, they received marriage rights, both for free Blacks and enslaved Blacks in the period. And so it might seem like they would also have been buried in these churchyards, but actually my research has found that for the most part, Black residents were excluded from the white-run churches that they attended in terms of burial. So the most, I think, illustrative example of this is in Christ Church, which kept very extensive burial records throughout its entire existence. It still exists today. And it would, in the burial record, it would list the name, the date, sometimes the disease that caused the person's death, and then the burying ground where the person was buried. And in the only burial record for a Black person, William Richards, who was listed as a Negro belonging to Joseph Richards, so a slave, his burial ground is listed as unknown. So there's a couple different interpretations of that fact, but I think the most compelling one is that he was not buried at the Christ Church burying ground or St. Peter's burying ground. Instead, he may have received burial rights at Christ Church and then was buried elsewhere. And that would have been a norm for Black residents of Philadelphia before 1792, which was the formation of the first Black church. But even if you aren't allowed to be buried in a white churchyard, you still have to be buried somewhere, and that somewhere was the Potter's Field. So the Potter's Field typically is considered a burial site for people who didn't really have any place else to go. So often poor people were buried here, people who died in prison, unclaimed bodies from the city hospital, and most Black residents of Philadelphia. So the southwest corner, so the bottom left, was the African American burial site in the Potter's Field. It was also known colloquially as Congo Square because oftentimes Black residents of Philadelphia would gather there and use it as kind of a public space since they didn't really have access to any other public spaces in the city. And the Potter's Field is a really interesting example of the Black community attempting to control public space well before Black churches and Black institutions formally allowed them to do so. So there were petitions by various groups of Black men in 1782 and 1787, which attempted to partition that bottom left corner of the Potter's Field as essentially a private burying space that the Black community could control either legally or functionally, if not, in terms of actual legal ownership. Both of these petitions were denied. And the fact that the Black community was unable to really secure control of this space was especially important because of body snatching, which is a very prevalent trend in this period because the 1760s and 1770s saw the emergence of the first anatomical lectures in Philadelphia. They were headed by a couple people, but by William Shipman most prominently. And there was this emerging school of medical thought that in order to be a good doctor, you had to have dissected a body. So William Shipman had a series of anatomical lectures that he advertised where he promised that the attendees of the lectures would be able to dissect a body. The problem was that no one wanted to be dissected, and so he had to go and find bodies from usually the city hospital or people who had been executed. So this is a quote, you can read it, I won't read it out loud, if you can see it. Essentially, so this is a quote that was published in a newspaper because there were rumors circulating that William Shipman was stealing bodies. And as you can see from this quote, he was pretty adamant that he wasn't. However, he was. And as a result of the situation of control in the Potter's Field, because the Potter's Field was a public site that didn't have, people who were invested in it, who didn't necessarily have living relatives, the Potter's Field was a place where he could take bodies with relatively little repercussions. But as I said, the southwest corner, the Congo Square, is sort of a different scenario because Congo Square was the site where Black residents ended up sort of more generally, they did have connections to the Black community. And there was a desire of the Black community to control that space. So the Black community in particular felt wronged by this body snatching, although it didn't target Black people in particular. They did feel that there was a special burden placed on them. And so actually they ended up turning to basically vigilante groups to ensure that they could protect the needs of they could protect the bodies of the people that were buried there. The Free African Society was founded in 1787. They were actually one of the groups that filed this petition to enclose the section of the Potter's Field that belonged to the Black community, which I think is really illustrative of the fact that public health concerns were sort of very present in the consciousness of the Black community at the time. And yellow fever, there was a huge yellow fever epidemic in 1793 that really served as the first testing ground for this commitment to public health, because as yellow fever swept through the city, there was a rumor or a report that Black Philadelphians and Black people more broadly were immune to yellow fever, and so made particularly good nurses. That wasn't true. They weren't immune to yellow fever at all, and that became clear very quickly. But the Black community continued to serve as nurses throughout the epidemic, and continued to work in the health field, both for white Philadelphians and Black Philadelphians, all throughout the epidemic, even though they would have been well within their rights to stop, which I think again really shows how much public health was informing the actions of the community in this time. 1792 was the formation of the first Black church in Philadelphia. And as a result of sort of all these factors I've been discussing, the formation of the Black church represented a culmination and a continuation of these public health efforts that had been in existence for decades. Creating churchyards allowed Black residents to control the sites, which they had long been excluded from. And even though there were challenges to the control of this space, Black church leaders were still able to make use of legal channels like incorporation to create spatial solutions to these challenges in the growing city. So incorporation was one way that they did that. It allowed for institutions like Black churches to root the ownership of property in a corporation rather than an individual, which made it a much more secure sort of status. It had a much more secure status. It could outlast individual deaths. And this was one way in which a lot of these churches carved out space for themselves in the city, both in terms of owning churches and pursuing that spiritual need, but also in terms of making sure that they could own the land on which the church was situated and the land in which the bodies of their congregants were buried. Nuisance laws were something else that were sort of operating in the time period. So nuisance laws were related to public health in that often nuisance complaints would be leveraged against sites that were thought to threaten the health and safety of others. A number of Black churches in this period received nuisance citations, and so again, that has a couple of different interpretations. That could mean that they really were a threat to public health, but also, as you can see, the blue is where many of these Black churches were situated. This is the Gray Square is Philadelphia before 1854. And as you can see, all of these are situated in pretty prime real estate, or many of them are situated in prime real estate in the downtown. And I think that nuisance laws were one way of exerting social pressure and financial pressure on these sites to essentially try to grab the land for urban development. So as you can see, these are all in pretty much the center of the city. And then on this map on the left, on your right, the green dots are places where rural cemeteries cropped up in 1849. So as you can see, as the city is growing, as populations are growing, and as the city is developing, one move that Black churches and churchyards made, and the Black community more broadly made, was to move outside of the city limits so that they could have space that wasn't coming under threat in the same way. And so they could continue caring for the needs of their community and addressing these public health needs and controlling space without the same level of pressure that they experienced when they were in the city. Thank you. I think is there time for questions?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Does anyone have questions?
So biblically, the Potter's Field is one of the first religion rulers following Christ. Do you know who actually owned the Potter's Field, or who bought it in the first place?
The Potter's Field was run by the city corporation. So they actually allowed, at various points, individuals to lease it. So the individuals would basically have grazing rights in exchange for like upkeeping the fence, but it was always owned by the city until, I think it's actually still owned by the city. Yeah, so it's been owned by the city the whole time.
Have you had a chance to look at it? I know you touched on this just briefly at the very end, but other cemeteries that are outside the city limits that wouldn't have a church attached? Like I'm thinking about Eden Cemetery in Yeadon, for instance.
So Eden was actually founded in 1902. I do talk about it in so this is the result of my thesis work. It's a little bit outside of my time period for the historical analysis, but what's really interesting about Eden is that even today it bills itself as a cemetery of cemeteries because on the one hand, it was part of this kind of broader movement to rural cemeteries and not churchyards, so like you say, not attached to a church, that were also privately owned. But on the other hand, one thing that's really interesting is some of the green dots that I pointed out are cemeteries that actually closed down and had the bodies that were buried there, or most of the bodies, moved to Eden. So a lot of times once a site would close, the bodies would be disinterred and would end up at Eden. So it's a really interesting sort of through line in the history of churches is that even though, and it was also a problem when I was researching, is even though Eden is 1902, it's still very much connected to the broader kind of trajectory of these sites.
Okay, so thank you, Jubilee. On behalf, on behalf of the Falvey Memorial Library and the Center for Research and Fellowships, I'd like to present to you 2019 Falvey Scholar Award. There's a gift card on the back. Okay, thank you. Now, I'd like to invite faculty mentor Dr. Michael Curran to introduce our second scholar.
Good morning, everyone. So Markieff Erestrum is majoring in economics and political science this year, and then next year he'll be with us for an extra 5th year and hopes to get a master's in political science and statistics. And then hopefully, if we can bring him to our side of the coin, he'll do economics after that in the graduate studies. So his research today he's talking about is based on a 300-year-old idea, which a lot of economists have discarded in the meantime, mostly because they've forgotten about it. So bring back to about 300 years ago, there was a Scottish economist who was a convicted murderer for murdering a man in a duel over a woman, as you do back then. And he basically was put into prison, but somehow he miraculously fled from London and became the equivalent of, today in America, what you'd call the chairman of the Federal Reserve and the Secretary of the Treasury combined into one. So a very powerful job, and started one of the first stock market booms and busts in Europe around 1716 to 1721. Now, spotting some issues with this system was an Irish-French economist called Richard Cantillon, who Matthew's interested in. Now, he was actually 50 years before Adam Smith, who is the father of economics, and actually unified, but it was mostly forgotten about, unified a theory of economics. And one particular aspect of that theory is to do with this idea that if you actually receive money first, you get to spend it before prices rise, and thus it exacerbates inequality. And so in a previous paper that Matthew's worked on with 2 professors in economics, including myself, we've actually submitted it for the publication, he shows that overall money increasing can basically exacerbate overall wealth inequality across the world. For today, he's looking at sector inequality, so looking at the financial industry in particular. So this paper he's presenting has just won the first prize in the Adam Smith competition in the economics department, and he'll be defending it later on today, so no pressure, Matthew. So without further ado, Markieff Erestrum.
Okay, so thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Curran. So as you can see, I'll be looking at the financial industry. And what I mean by a fiat currency, because I know this is not a audience of economists, is that if you go to the bank with $1 and you say, I would like to redeem this, you're going to get 4 quarters or 10 dimes. However, pre-1973, if you said, I want to redeem this, you would get 1/35 of an ounce of gold. So all I mean by a fiat currency is a currency that's not backed by any sort of commodity or precious metal or anything like that. And as you can see by the title, my work is going to be primarily data-driven, although I will be talking about the theory about why this relationship in the data makes sense. So first, why is this important? Why should we care about fiat currency and how it may have impacted the financial industry? Well, first, the financial industry has grown in size since the 1970s and 1980s. Secondly, the financial industry has a somewhat poorly understood impact on the performance of the overall economy. To give you one example, after the 2008 financial crisis, the London School of Economics convened multiple conferences to determine what it was that the financial industry actually did. And in the findings of their report, which they call the future of finance, they don't actually come to a strong conclusion about what it is that the financial industry has really been doing this whole time. So because the financial industry's impact in the economy is poorly understood, maybe investigating why it's grown to be the size that it has can give us some answers about what it is that it's doing and what impact it has on the economy. And finally, other explanations for the size of the financial industry really just look at deregulation and political pressures as the major culprit, as opposed to looking at monetary policy. So what is the relevant literature? What have previous scholars looked at? Well, we start with Cantillon with the 1755 publication of the Essai sur la nature du commerce en général, or the Essay on the Nature of Commerce in General. It was published in 1755, as I mentioned, after his death, and it discusses the central concept, which is the main theoretical underpinning of the paper, which is that first receivers of new money can increase their expenditures before prices rise, and therefore benefit from this receipt of new money before inflation punishes everyone else in the economy. Now, this theory has really not been looked at in the economics literature, aside from work that I've been doing empirically and work that a few scholars working out of the Austrian tradition have done theoretically. So as for the 3 papers that actually examine the size of the financial industry, I'll start from the most political to the least political. So publishing in the British Journal of Political Science, Whitcoe argues in his 2016 paper that deregulation is the driving factor, as well as lobbying by the financial sector. Additionally, he points out that as unions grow weaker, the financial industry is able to lobby more effectively. And so the Whitcoe paper has been very useful for my own research in terms of determining control variables. For Philippon and Reshef in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, they also mention that deregulation has been particularly important, primarily by driving the demand for human capital in the financial industry. However, his research is undercut somewhat by OECD research, which has found that even after for controlling levels of education, people in the financial industry are still better paid, 1, than they were, and 2, than comparable industries. And finally, abstracting from politics even more completely than Whitcoe and Philippon and Reshef, is Greenwood and Sharfstein in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. And they find that the financial industry has grown and pays better, primarily because of increasing complexity and securitization. I will touch briefly on other sorts of relevant literature. New data sources make this research possible. In particular, EU CLEMS, which despite the name EU does have US data, and the Financial Deregulation Index, begun by Abiet et al. Working for the IMF and continued by Dank and Gomez working for the OECD. So the two types of monetary policy that I investigated in the literature are the case of sort of Japan's forbearance lending and zombie firms, or similarly in communist economies, these sort of soft budget constraints where failing firms are continually lent new money. But since that's not the case in the US, what ended up being the most interesting kind of monetary policy to look at was what's called asymmetric monetary policy. And all that means is that the Federal Reserve is much more likely to be very loose with its policy during a financial downturn than it is to be tight with its monetary policy during an overheated economy. So, and finally, looking at finance and its impact on the economy, there are papers that find that financial development increases inequality and papers that find that financial development reduces inequality. So again, we don't know what the financial industry really does. So what is it that our research is doing differently? Well, unlike the other papers, we're using a much more sophisticated statistical technique, which is called a vector autoregression. And while it's common in the finance inequality growth literature, no one has applied it to the size of the financial industry, which I find somewhat confusing. So the main advantage of our paper, aside from its statistical significance and its sophistication, is that we are the only paper that has data after the Great Recession. So we get to see how the financial industry has changed since the financial crisis and the subsequent re-regulation of the financial industry. Additionally, because our start date is 1973, we get to look at how the monetary environment has changed through the Bretton Woods system and after its collapse, and I'll touch on Bretton Woods briefly. Additionally, we get to comment on non-neutralities of money caused by monetary policy in the short and long run, and this is due to the impulse response functions that vector autoregressions give you, which show the impact in one time period and how that impact decays or doesn't decay over time. And finally, we'll be looking at both money creation and interest rates, because monetary policy is not just how much money there is, it's also what's the interest rate the Federal Reserve is targeting. To briefly touch on why Bretton Woods is important, Bretton Woods was what was called a gold exchange standard. So the rest of the countries in the world set a fixed exchange rate with the US dollar, and the US dollar was pegged to 1/35 of an ounce of gold. Essentially, we were on a gold standard, but everyone else was on a dollar standard. So during this time period, US inflation was considerably constrained. If you look at rates of money growth and rates of price inflation in the United States from the beginning of the Bretton Woods period, so the mid-1950s, when everyone else finally got on the exchange rate system, and 73 with the collapse of the Smithsonian Agreement, US price inflation and money growth were below the world average. But throughout this period, it kept trending upwards towards the world average. And finally, when the Smithsonian Agreement collapsed in 73, US monetary policy became considerably more expansionary. That's why it's important. It's because it lets much more money printing happen. Why is money printing important, you may be asking? Because of Richard Cantillon. Those who get this newly printed money, which in the US is the financial industry because they're the ones connected to the central banks, are able to spend this money. They can bid up wages, which are why wages in the financial industry are higher, or they can use it to make additional loans, which is why the financial industry has grown in size. And therefore, theoretically, we may expect the financial industry to grow as the money supply grows. I will spare you the intricacies of the data collection, but just to mention that, again, this is made possible by new data sources such as EU CLEMS and the Abiet et al. And Dank and Gomez Financial Regulation Index. And I will just comment briefly that I'm using a structural vector autoregression because a regular vector autoregression, what's called the reduced form, doesn't give you economic significance, and so if we use a sign-restricted vector autoregression, we therefore can actually make comments on long and short-run relationships that we can't make in a reduced form bar. So to give you the results, turns out Richard Cantillon, writing in the 1700s, was right, that if you print money and give it to the financial industry has more money. And therefore, that the fiat currency regime under which we are currently operating has systematically benefited the financial industry at the expense of the rest of the economy. So I'll show you first the reduced form VARs, and then I will show you the structural VARs for the monetary base and compensation in the financial industry, the M1 money supply and compensation in the financial industry, and the federal funds rate and compensation in the financial industry. And I'll do the same thing for the relative size of the financial industry. And I will skip through executive compensation because the time period is too small for the results to actually make any sense. So what do we see in the reduced form VARs? We see that when there's a shock in the monetary base or an increase, that wages in the financial industry relative to other wages increase, and that this is true for both the data in levels, the data in first differences, and sort of what's called detrended data, or removing the non-stationarity, and that the federal funds rate also has a positive effect, as does the M1 money supply. However, things become much more interesting when we look at the structural VARs. So as we see here, if you look at the log of the monetary base, which is the sort of middle one on the right-hand side, or my right-hand side, you can see that that impulse never decays to zero, which means that this response stays in the long run. For the M1 money supply, it becomes statistically insignificant, but it's still, the point estimate does not decay to zero for the money supply. The interesting thing is that for the federal funds rate, it decays rather quickly, which is interesting because higher interest rates and looser money are opposite policy responses. So the expansionary monetary response dominates in the long term. The same exact relationship holds for the size of the financial industry for all three variables, but executive compensation, the results don't look like anything because, again, the time period is just too small. So in conclusion, if you increase the money supply or raise interest rates, the financial industry will be larger and people in the financial industry will be better paid. Therefore, we should be looking at monetary inflation and the damages of that as opposed to just price inflation. And consistent with the literature on monetary policy and overall inequality, interest rates and money creation have opposite effects. That is, contractionary interest rate policy benefits the financial industry, but expansionary monetary policy benefits the financial industry. So I don't mean to, for my conclusions, I'm not trying to say that therefore we need to get rid of central banks and completely abolish the Fed. I'm just saying central banks need to be careful about how their money creation impacts the economy. Thank you.
Quickly, one question, if you have a question for Matthew.
If the United States had not gone off the gold standard with the same, do you suspect that the same result would have occurred?
So I think the relationship itself would still hold, just because the fact that, the Federal Reserve has been in existence since 1913, so this linkage between the financial industry and the central bank is still obviously there, but the effects, I think, would have been much smaller. Because if monetary policy is constrained, then they can't pump as much money into the financial sector. And so the relationship itself holds, but would be much smaller in magnitude.
Well, thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
On behalf of Falvey Memorial Library and the Center for Research and Fellowships, I'd like to present to you with 2019 Falvey Scholar Award.
Thank you.
There you go. Congratulations.
Thanks so much.
All right. Now, I'd like to invite faculty mentor Dr. Dina Weisberg to introduce our third Falvey Scholar.
Thank you, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Erica Ferrara, who is a psychology major. Erica started working on this project earlier this year, and it is especially impressive to me because this is the second of two honors theses that Erica is completing this year, one for the university and one for the department. In addition, she is completing a very prestigious internship at CHOP, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She's a Villanova cheerleader and engages widely with lots of other community organizations.
which you will hear a little bit about her commitment to improving the lives of young children in her presentation. And I'm also very pleased to announce that she will be going on to graduate work next year at Fordham University to get her master's. So, Erica.
Okay, so my project today was on test anxiety in elementary school students in relation to standardized testing. So my kind of big research problem that I've been focusing on this year is in a time of increased standardized testing, how can researchers best intervene to help students in elementary schools experience test anxiety? So kind of a little background, how I started my project was doing research on anxiety and then on standardized testing and then on past intervention and prevention programs that have been effective. And then this semester I'm more focused on designing my own intervention and proposing an experiment that could test the efficacy of that in reducing test anxiety in elementary school students. So anxiety in general is defined as excessive future-oriented worry about uncertain outcomes. Test anxiety specifically is a form of state anxiety, which is triggered by a test. And it kind of involves students having disproportionate concern about negative consequences on exams. And so part of my research, I looked into the possible causes of it, and there are some internal ones that are related to genetics and predisposure to the personality trait of neuroticism. A little bit about growth mindset and grit, which is how likely a student is to see failure as an opportunity to overcome and learn. And then also the idea of academic self-concept, which is a student's belief in their academic ability. And then more of the external causes could have to do with their relationships with teachers and parents and how much pressure they're perceiving from them and if there's kind of conditional support there. But overall, the main triggering part of test anxiety is the standardized test. So just to summarize my research on that, there's a couple of studies that found kind of a correlational thing as in America, standardized testing is increasing right now in elementary schools, and so are rates of test anxiety. So anywhere from 10 to 40% of elementary school students are currently experiencing test anxiety in the United States. And while that's like a significant, even just 10% is definitely a significant amount of students experiencing it. So that's why this is a very important problem, I feel like, to look into how we could best intervene to help those students. And the problem with anxiety, a little bit of anxiety is always natural and can help with performance, actually. But once it becomes impairing, kind of overtakes everything, it becomes a problem in everyday life and function, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about now. So some of the symptoms of test anxiety that I found fall into three categories of cognitive, physiological, and behavioral symptoms. So cognitive focuses on kind of intrusive, repetitive, negative thoughts that a student could have, perhaps comparing themselves to other students negatively, and feeling that pressure. And then more physiological ones have to do with being in a state of autonomic arousal, which can involve aches and muscle tensions, nausea, headaches, sleeping problems. And then more behavioral ones can include restlessness, irritability, and then students tend to have kind of two reactions, one towards striving for perfectionism on tests, and the other one kind of shutting down and being more avoidant of it. Another effect of test anxiety that is kind of up and coming in the research, not like confirmed, but there seems to be a correlation is, as I mentioned, with performance. There's a possible negative correlation with the more test anxiety students experience, that maybe it could affect performance and performance will be lower on tests, which is a major problem because the entire purpose of standardized testing is capturing the student's ability, and if it's affected by test anxiety, it's not truly capturing their ability. Another very important point in my research was that each case of test anxiety can manifest differently, so students each don't necessarily experience all these symptoms or experience them at different severities, so it really does vary by individual case. So just in terms of prior research, to kind of sum up what I found, there is a variety of cognitive strategies, behavioral strategies, and then also ones that focus on the actual form of the test and how it's administered that previous programs have found to be effective in combating test anxiety in elementary school students. And so what I worked on more this semester is designing my own ideal intervention, and I wanted it to be as effective as possible for as many students as possible. And as I mentioned, each case of test anxiety is very different. So I took each of the effective strategies I found in prior research and combined them into one comprehensive intervention. That way that a student could be exposed to all of them and then pick and choose which one they found most effective for themselves and most helpful. And So now I'll talk a little bit more about the intervention structure I designed. So it would consist of 10 interventions that would meet 2 times a week for 5 weeks. 8 of them would be small group meetings with about 12 students in each, and then 2 would be more general classroom-wide sessions. And the general format of them was each one would focus on a kind of strategy for combating test anxiety, and it would involve a school partner that would be recruited by the research team to be trained in administering the intervention, and then they would have a kind of lecture about the goals of the session, that particular session, and then more practice activities for them practicing the strategy. And it would also involve some parent-teacher consultation sessions just to keep them informed about what their child is learning and be able to help support them in, at home and in the classroom as well. So just an example, I'm not going to go through each of the sessions, but one of the sessions involves the stop, drop, and roll method, which is an effective behavioral strategy that I found was effective in prior research. So kind of the goals of this session particularly is to combat symptoms of autonomic arousal, which I mentioned as a physiological symptom of test anxiety, by trying to relax the body. And so the stop, drop, and roll method is involved like when you sense symptoms of test anxiety, kind of put down your pencil if you're taking a test, put your hands on your desk, drop your head, and then roll it like that. And it's supposed to release some muscle tension, and kind of like reset your nervous system and get you out of that state. So this session in particular, the school partner would start by explaining the goals of the session to the children just to understand, and there would be session before this is more of a cognitive strategy one also, and that's like related, so I just wanted to transition. That's why I said that's connection in session 3. Then go through the stop, drop, and roll method, maybe demonstrate it, and then provide like a handout listing the steps so the students can keep track of it and exemplify it. And there'd be a kind of imagined exposure activity where the school partner would read through prompts that may provoke some test anxiety, like you sit down for a test, the test is about to be administered, so maybe the students would feel it, and then they'll have an opportunity to just practice the method in kind of a more low-stakes environment before actually having to do it during a testing situation, just to get the practice in there. And at the end of the session, the students, the school partner would review the method once more, and the students could write down one thing that they learned in their own words just to refer back to in case they want to use this strategy in the future if they found it to be effective for them. So just quick intervention summary, because I don't want to go through it all, is that the first 2 sessions would be more about education of test anxiety, just giving the background of the symptoms so students can learn how to identify that in themselves. The third session would be about cognitive strategies. It's called the 3 C's method, in which you check, you catch, check, and change a negative thought that's going through your mind as one of the cognitive symptoms of test anxiety. And then the next thing I mentioned, the stop, drop, and roll method, is the beginning of a 3 series of behavioral strategies that involve like deep breathing, just deep breaths like that. It's part of the stop, drop, and roll method. And then progressive muscle relaxation, just working through the body, releasing tension in each area. And then the next 2 will be more test-taking skills and timetables for like planning your timeout and then setting schedules before the test so you feel prepared and not in such an anxious state going into it. And then throughout them, there's multiple practice experiences I mentioned. There's a couple of imagined exposure exercises and practice test-taking towards the later ones. And then again, as I mentioned, the students are then free to select whichever strategies they found most helpful to themselves and practice those in the future. Just quickly about the potential experiment that could test the efficacy of this in actually reducing test anxiety that I proposed to design. I want to focus on 4th graders in New York elementary schools because New York State specifically is known for its standardized testing and having very high rates of it. And 4th grade, in my research, I studied mostly 3rd to 5th grade, so most of the programs I found to be effective focus on that age group, and 4th grade are in the middle. And 4 test-anxious students from each class would be recommended by their teachers as maybe benefiting from this program, for a total of 24 enrolled in this year. And the design would be an experimental group and a control group, and there'd be like maybe 6 classes of 4th graders, and 3 would go into each one just randomly assigned. So the only difference is both would be going through data collection this year, but then the experimental group would get the intervention this year, and the control group would not, just have a comparison, and then the control group would get it next school year just as a thank you for enrolling and completing the data collection. So just quickly, data collection, there would be 3 different time points, one at baseline after assent and consent from the students and parents, And I looked into this. The Children's Test Anxiety Scale is a good measure of general test anxiety scores. You could get a comprehensive one from the students' rating on a Likert scale, just how much they agree with statements that have to do with test anxiety, how much they experience it, and then a parent adapted one for their parents to answer, and then a teacher adapted one for their teachers to go through and kind of get data from different sources that way. And then post-treatment, at the end of the intervention, only the experimental group could fill out a questionnaire just how they felt about the intervention, if there should be any improvements, if they were recommended to other students, if they thought it was effective. And then a delayed post-test time frame after 4th grade standardized tests to kind of see if the intervention did have an effect. The students would, again, fill out the TAS, and the parents and teachers would fill out theirs to see if maybe their levels of test anxiety this time through were a little different, lower. Hopefully the ratings were lower. And there's a use of strategies questionnaire for the students to see if they did use the strategies that were taught in the intervention. And then also, as like a kind of ancillary study, we could collect test scores as well, just their 3rd grade standardized test scores, and then the 4th grade ones to see if there was any effect of the intervention on performance, as there might be. Just as accepted results, as I kind of mentioned, hopefully the CTAS scores would be lower for the experimental group, and control group may be around the same. And standardized test scores as well, we might see a slight difference in performance. Broader impacts, specifically, if the intervention is shown to be effective, this might have implications because it's very easy to implement, and we can bring it to other schools to help more children with test anxiety. And the more we learn about the best methods to combat test anxiety in general, to help reduce student individual stress and increase learning and success, maybe decrease dropout rates from schools as students enjoy it more, and just in general better our institutions as a whole. Yeah, so just conclusions. Test anxiety is very prevalent in parenting. Standardized testing is increasing, and so is test anxiety, which makes it very important for us to find effective prevention and intervention methods. And a couple of effective strategies have been found. An ideal intervention would combine all of them, especially for highly individualized cases. Students would be free to pick and choose which are best for them. And hope this intervention would be effective and it could be brought to more schools. Thank you.
Any question for Erica?
Yeah.
Yeah, so is there a difference between test anxiety when students are given a standardized test from the state versus, their regular classroom tests, and why might there be that difference?
So I actually did do a little bit of research about that when I was first looking into it last semester, and they multiple studies have found a difference in that there tends to be more test anxiety for standardized tests than regular classroom tests, just because the stakes tend to be higher, there's more time constraints, and also there might be effect with how teachers perceive it, because a lot of teachers, sometimes their jobs are on the line, or like they are judged as well for students' performance, and students can kind of sense that pressure from them, especially on standardized testing more than even classroom testing.
Great, thank you, Erica. On behalf of the Falvey Memorial Library and the Center for Research and Fellowship, I'd like to present to you 2019 Falvey Scholar Award. Thank you. There you go. Congratulations! This is so interesting because I have a 10 years old fourth grader. Now I'd like to invite our faculty mentor, Dr. Helene Moriarty, to introduce our next scholar. Thank you.
I am delighted to introduce Erin Donnelly, who is a senior student in the Fitzpatrick College of Nursing. She is also a presidential scholar, is in the honors program, and is also minoring in Spanish. During her time at Villanova, Erin was a freshman match in that program, and also has worked with faculty on 4 different research studies and has published with faculty. She is talking about moral injury, which is a very rich, multidimensional construct, and in that process, she searched diverse fields of literature to better understand this complex concept. Erin presented this work at the Ethics of War and Peace Conference, at the Undergraduate Scholars Day, here, of course, and was invited to submit an abstract for a presentation at the National VA Suicide Prevention Conference, and she plans to publish this important work. Erin has shown a very deep and sincere interest and commitment to the care of military veterans and their families, and this passion has driven her work. I'm very pleased to introduce Erin Donnelly.
Thank you, Dr. Moriarty. So the concept of moral injury has been circulating in the clinical literature for just over a decade, but its roots date back to a much earlier time period. A psychological injury that results from transgressions of deeply held moral beliefs and expectations has been documented in history as early as the warrior culture of ancient Greece. In terms of moral injury, or as the term moral injury suggests, the problem is extremely multidimensional. The name itself denotes that the care required would be physical and psychological in order to heal the injury, but also spiritual to address the moral distress and conflict. In recent years, more clinicians and interdisciplinary teams have sought to operationalize the definition of moral injury in order to design interventions and treat military personnel returning from service. This is where the interdisciplinary team has the opportunity to fill a role in the care of veterans with wounded souls. The term moral injury was first coined by psychiatrist Dr. Jonathan Shea and his colleagues. They proposed the following criteria to be present in a moral injury. 1, a betrayal of what is right. 2, by a person in legitimate authority. An example would be a military leader. And 3, in a high-stakes situation. This action or order by a leader violates the soldier's deeply held beliefs of what is right, resulting in a moral injury. Following this introduction of the term into the literature, a second clinical definition was crafted. Distinct from Shea's work, Dr. Brett Litz and colleagues defined moral injury as the enduring consequences of perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. The two definitions are distinct in that they label the violator of the moral code differently, either the power-holding figure or the self. However, they are similarly devastating to a veteran's mental and physical well-being. So, Litz and colleagues developed the first conceptual model of moral injury applied clinically, and this is it. Their work has been interpreted, leading to the development of theoretical frameworks and interventions to mitigate the effects of moral injury. In order for a veteran to have a moral injury, he or she must experience a transgressive act. So these acts include perpetration or commission, an example would be killing, an inability to prevent death or harm, an omission, witnessing these events, losing a loved one, or being betrayed by a trusted leader, and even being exposed to an environment of human suffering. A critical characteristic common to these events is that they are inconsistent with the moral code of a veteran and will cause inner conflict and dissonance. In general, servicemen and women who endure combat exposure and longer deployments are at an increased risk for experiencing transgressive acts. In a comprehensive literature review conducted by Frankfurt and Fraser in 2016, data was compiled to estimate the prevalence of United States military personnel who were exposed to transgressive acts. It is important to note that these researchers included acts that were both within and outside the rules of engagement. The most recent cohort of veterans, those who served in Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, is reported to be at high risk for exposure. Approximately 40 to 50% of OIF soldiers and 65% of OIF Marines have killed an enemy combatant. In this same cohort, the OIF, 12 to 15% of soldiers and 28% of Marines have killed a non-combatant or a civilian. Additionally, in a comprehensive study of OIF and OEF veterans from all military branches, 9.5% report engaging in hand-to-hand combat, 5% reported being directly responsible for civilian deaths, and another 5% reported witnessing civilian brutality. Similarly, Vietnam veterans are at high risk for some transgressive act exposure. So of those encountering transgressive acts in combat from all wars, there is no data determining the number of servicemen and women who go on to experience moral injury. So how a veteran interprets this moral infraction will influence the outcome. So if a veteran's appraisal is global, meaning it applies in all circumstances, stable, feeling as though they have a permanent sense of taintedness, and internal, viewing it as a personal character flaw, it perpetuates negative moral emotions such as shame and guilt. Shame and guilt have been characterized as cognitive affective states or moral emotions present in moral injury. So guilt is a painful and motivating cognitive emotional experience that can be linked to conflict with a personal or communal moral code. It involves negative self-evaluations of one's actions. So an example would be, I feel bad about what I did. So this emotion is actually adaptive and that it will correctly morally evaluate the action and then it discourages someone from doing it again. In contrast, shame involves negative self-evaluation regardless of the action. So the example is, I am a bad person because of what I did. This negative global appraisal of oneself often results in violence, anger, avoidance, and a decreased empathy for others. It is also tied to the belief that others view them negatively, leading to extensive withdrawal and further perpetuation of shame. So withdrawal is a particularly problematic symptom in this model as it hinders healthy community reintegration. So the community is actually often a setting that assists in the positive self-appraisal of and reframing of morally injurious events. However, as the model describes, once withdrawn, the service member will begin to experience consequences of severe moral conflict, which can manifest themselves in behavioral, cognitive, and emotional ways. These negative behaviors, which can be characterized as signs and symptoms, will continue to perpetuate others until an intervention is implemented. It's often a cycle that is very difficult to exit. So in a mixed method study of 23 healthcare and religious professionals who had consistent contact with veterans, a group of researchers identified some possible signs and symptoms of moral injury. So these are 5 unique themes with examples. Many of these were seen on the previous slide in the conceptual model. And this data contributes to the evidence seeking to distinguish moral injury from post-traumatic stress disorder, which is an important discussion. So recognizing that the diagnostic criteria and conceptual models for PTSD were not able to account for certain symptoms documented in patients with the disorder, clinicians began to theorize other possible trauma models, which include moral injury. So the diagnostic criteria include exposure, or for PTSD, include exposure to traumatic events, and then subsequent maladaptive behaviors like fear, anxiety, and hyperarousal, and as well as cognitive states like shame, guilt, and the inability to feel pleasure. So the revision of the PTSD criteria in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual in 2013 actually includes the negative cognitive affective states of shame and guilt, and that does make it more difficult to tease moral injury away from post-traumatic stress. However, there are still some symptoms not included in the diagnostic features of PTSD that present themselves. So the differentiation between PTSD and moral injury becomes important when choosing an intervention. Evidence-based PTSD treatment is often characterized by repeat exposure and fear conditioning. So while this is effective for warriors experiencing the physiological fear responses related to trauma exposure, these interventions are actually shown to be detrimental to a veteran who has experienced a moral injury. So using the diagnostic criteria for PTSD and the conceptual model for moral injury presented, Brian and his colleagues recently theorized or tested this theorized overlap of the symptoms model. So they anonymously surveyed 930 National Guard personnel and found that PTSD was most often characterized by a startle reflex, memory loss, self-reported flashbacks, nightmares, and insomnia, whereas moral injury was characterized by guilt, shame, anhedonia, social alienation, and anger. So now that we know that there's a place for moral injury, it is important for nurses and healthcare professionals, as well as other disciplines, to be knowledgeable about existing interventions so that they're able to help their patients who are experiencing these things. So the first and most widely cited in the literature is the adaptive disclosure approach. So this intervention is available and is a cognitive-based therapy that is, has been adapted from treatment in PTSD, patients with PTSD. So veterans engage in imaginal exposure exercises and they're asked to process the emotional aspects of their war memory. Through this processing, associations have been made, the associations they've made to themselves are unearthed. So, and this found, this model was tested in 2012, and it found that the early intervention adaptive disclosure resulted in improvements in symptom severity. So I was recently in email correspondence with Dr. Brett Litz, who's actually working on this study to get more updated information about what they're doing in adaptive disclosure. And so he wrote, "We have finished a clinical trial of an 8-session version of adaptive disclosure and are writing up the results. The trial was positive. We have greatly expanded the original treatment and are now calling it ADE, so Adaptive Disclosure Enhanced. This is a 12-session therapy that adds compassion training, such as loving kindness meditation, systematic letter writing to support in-session work, and expanded homework in service of repair and healing. So this revised model is currently being tested in a VA-funded clinical trial, so we're going to keep an eye out for those publications. Another possible intervention is called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. This therapy, based in six core processes, is predicted to approach many of the issues experienced in moral injury. Some of these include fostering forgiveness in a manner that's not dismissive of shame, holding and honoring morally injurious experiences in a way that empathizes with ongoing suffering, and inviting engagement from care providers in the community. So in my research, I've not yet found follow-up to this prediction, but it is said that there is work going on within the VA around this intervention. Building Spiritual Strength, or BSS, is a group therapy approach that's meant to discuss the spiritual distress often caused by morally injurious events for veterans. This can link them to chaplains and pastoral care, and that is extremely important and can be helpful for those who are grappling with their actions spiritually and the repercussions, especially for those who are a part of a faith-based ideology. And then finally, the community itself offers its own strength in terms of interventions. So community reintegration refers to the participation of in work, home, and school in a productive and meaningful like social activities and relationships. And it's the premier goal of rehab for men and women returning from service. So isolation from the community hinders the process of healing from moral injury and self-forgiveness because it prevents the veteran from having corrective and reparative experiences. Recently, an article in the New York Times reinforced this idea by suggesting that the community is where healing, in the form of creative means of atonement, should occur. So the process of reconciling morally injurious events should occur in theaters parallel to those experienced and witnessed in combat. So, for example, a transgressive act against a foreign community, it would be helpful to have positive experiences in your own community. It is also important for the community to recognize the burden that our service men and women carry for us and support them throughout their recovery. In changing the mindset from wounded patients to community members, we will better be able to foster a welcoming environment and break the cycle of shame and guilt. And in closing, it is important to drive home how this applies to the many disciplines involved in holistic healthcare. As the government changes its policy related to veterans in private medical systems, we will begin to see more of these patients both within and outside of the VA systems. So it's particularly important to be informed about the evidence-based practice involved with the treatment of moral injury, particularly for the nursing community, because that's where I come from. The Joining Forces National Campaign is seeking to educate 3.5 million nurses on the needs of veterans and their families. Remember to ask, have you ever served? This line just opens the communication and the referrals to psychological services, pastoral care, and community resources to reconcile a moral injury. So, though moral injury is not a medical diagnosis and may never become one, it is important for veterans with these experiences to have access to multidimensional care in order to heal the burdens of war that they carry. Thank you.
Any questions?
Mm-hmm.
So this is a really interesting model that you've studied, particularly in the veteran community.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you could see its expansion to other similar communities, not specifically combat veterans, so police officers or prison guards or other people who might be experiencing these things, perhaps not in as acute fashion, but in an ongoing fashion as well.
Yes, absolutely. And even in the research and in the nursing community as well, there's been a lot of research around moral injury in nursing. And so there's a lot of literature out there as well. So I can see some adaptations to this particular model since it was designed for combat veterans who have experienced like a wartime scenario, because that may be a little bit different than what you'd experience here as like a first responder. So I think that with some adaptations, it can certainly be applicable to those communities because we are seeing the term of moral injury kind of pop up more frequently in other professions as well.
Any other questions? Thank you, Erin.
Thank you.
On behalf of Falvey Memorial Library and the Center for Research and Fellowship, I'd like to present to you with 2019 Falvey Scholar Award.
Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations. Yes. There you Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, I'd like to invite Dr. Samantha Chapman to introduce our next Falvey Scholar. Dr. Chapman. Thank you.
Good morning. It's my great pleasure to introduce my senior thesis student and someone who's been working in my lab for really the past 4 years. It's uncommon for a student to so quickly get engaged in research as Libby did, but I knew from the time she was in my general biology class that I was really excited to collaborate with her on research. And we've done lots of different kinds of research together today, and today she's going to be telling you about some work that she's been doing with myself and Dr. Matt Hayes, looking at foliar uptake of water in mangroves. It's a really fascinating and mechanistic investigation of something that mangroves do that's really different. So with that, I'll introduce Libby OBrien.
All right, so thank you everyone for coming, and if you had to be here, thank you for listening. So my name is Libby OBrien, and I'm presenting on foliar water uptake in ecotonal mangroves, which are expanding with climate change. So for the non-mangrove folks in here, foliar water uptake means the ability for plants to take in water through their leaves. So if you see the word foliar, think leaf. Just start off thanking a few people who made this project possible. My mentors, Samantha Chapman and Matt Hayes, as well as all of the lab members of the Chapman-Langley lab, past and present, and of course the library. So we know that plants need water to survive, right? It's important for everything from growing to survival to reproductive success. And often we think of how the water gets to the plants by rain, and it soaks into the ground and then goes up through the roots to the leaves. This is often thought of as common, but some recent research has found that this direction can change as well. The directional flow of water uptake is reversed in some plants where water might settle on leaves or might be surrounding them through dew or mist and be able to travel through the leaves down to the roots. So the way that we track how this happens is through these things called stable isotopes. And I think of stable isotopes as a tracer or a dye, and how you can see the presence of it in a leaf when you're looking at it later on after you've exposed a leaf to water with this tracer in it. So for my experiment, I used deuterium, which is an isotope of hydrogen. So some other plants that I said have used this technique are redwoods, so really tall trees, ferns, low ferns, as well as grasses. So you can see it's really diverse across the kinds of species that might utilize this technique, as well as where they're found in the world. So what's common about all of these together is that they're all water stressed in some capacity, and we think that that might link what kinds of plants use this technique. Redwoods, think of how tall they are. It's really hard for water to travel all the way up through the roots and the trees to the leaves, as well as ferns might be overshadowed in a forest and not have access to all of the water that they need. Grasses can often be found in desert locations. So what about mangroves? That's my main research question. You might recognize a mangrove by these jungle gym root structures. You can see them on the beaches in tropical regions. So I'm thinking of Florida, if you've ever been on vacation and you see these giant walls of trees, those are mangroves. They can look really big, such as this one here, or kind of shrubby, like that picture on the far side. Mangroves are often important because they offer ecosystem services. So an ecosystem service is something that happens naturally in an ecosystem or by natural processes that humans can kind of take advantage of. So we often monetize ecosystem services, and mangroves provide some, such as wave attenuation. So when waves from hurricanes hit the shore, mangroves are able to kind of cut off the impact of that wave, and it's able to kind of mitigate the damage that's done. Others include rising the sea floor to match the rates of sea level rise. So that can be used as a strategy to mitigate sea level rise in some regions, as well as providing protection and nurseries for smaller plants and animals. So I mentioned mangroves are found in tropical regions. These tropical regions span across the entire world, so everything from a Florida mangrove all the way over to Australia, the Philippines, Africa. They're pretty much found everywhere. So because they're on these coasts, they're actually in really salty soils, and the salt in this region acts as a drought. So we can see that connection between the redwood or the prairie grass that might be water stressed already and the salt, which mimics a drought situation, which is why mangroves could utilize foliar water uptake as a strategy to overcome that salty drought condition. There are lots of different kinds of mangroves, and when they're fully grown, they look really different from each other. So they might have those really big roots like I mentioned earlier, or they might look like a regular tree that you would see. I specifically looked at 3 different species. I'll call them white, black, and red. That's their common name. But when they're small and babies, they kind of all look the same. So this is my visual aid. You can take a look at the mangrove. And this is a black mangrove. So the whites and reds don't look terribly different. I would forgive you if you don't look at mangroves all day and can't tell the difference. I have a few hypotheses for my project. The first one is that mangrove leaves will increase in mass when they're submerged in water. So before doing this whole experiment of using this tracer and this really sciencey part, we did a relatively simple experiment to see if leaf pores, so they're called stomates, they're similar to what's on your face, open if the water can travel in and then maintain that leaf turgor, this like rigidness, and so they'll increase in weight after. The second hypothesis is that mangroves take up water through their leaves by fog exposure. So maybe not when they're fully submerged in water, but only partially submerged, like when the fog rolls in on the mornings in the coasts. The third is that mangrove species differ in their foliar water uptake. So the 3 that I mentioned before probably don't represent the same foliar water uptake capacity across them. So looking at my first hypothesis, we have the weighted leaves before and after soaking them. So what I did was I cut leaves off of the plant and I taped them to a string and then submerged them in water. So the idea is that the stem is out of the water so that it's not mimicking the original directional flow where it travels up through the roots to the leaves, but rather straight into the leaves. And from this we can see, well, I can see, I'm not sure if you can see, but that all of them show some level of increase in water content. So to walk you through this figure a little bit, this axis shows the percentage increase. So there's a percentage of before and after, how much bigger they got when the water went into them. And they're not terribly different, but there are some really interesting differences between them. The black and white mangroves ended up taking in more than the red mangroves. So something in the future would be to tease apart why those species are acting differently. All 3 of these show some sort of increase. My second hypothesis, ignore that part. The second hypothesis, mangroves take up water through their leaves by fog exposure, required us to do a little bit of construction. So out in the greenhouse, behind Mendel, if you don't know what that structure in the parking lot is, we built these 4 chambers with plastic and PVC, and inside of them we had the 3 different species and 3 plants of each species. We had a treatment and a control, and in the treatment we had that stable isotope in the water of a humidifier. So over the course of 4 nights and 6 hours each night, done at night so they wouldn't photosynthesize, we exposed the plants to this water and tracer, and we could see before and after. If the tracer was in the leaves, then they were doing the foliar water uptake that we were testing. Again, the figure's a little funky, but it's supposed to say all species showed foliar water uptake. And this is really interesting because we can see that, again, there are some species differences, and red seems to be an outlier among the other 2 that we've tested. So we found the tracer in all of them, which we call becomes enriched. So the higher up on this axis these bars and boxes are, means the more enriched the species is. So black and white became more enriched than red did. And black and white are more similar to each other than they are to the red species. This also answers our third hypothesis as well, that mangrove species differ in their foliar water uptake. So I'm really interested in why this is, especially for the red ones, and we think that it might have to do with something because the red leaves are thicker, and they're acting like a succulent, so they might be holding on to more of the water than the other plants, which might have a easier transport in and out. The pores might open more than the red ones do. So to tease apart the figure before a little bit more, we looked at how the before and after would look and how the individual species would take up the differences. So it turns out that doing some statistics on this, we find that only black mangroves in the treatment chambers utilize the foliar water uptake significantly compared to the red and white. So only in that one did the blacks take up more to show up in a statistical analysis. However, there's a trend that white did take up similarly to black, and we can see that in the figure before. But there's still a lot of variation. As you can see, the red before and after are relatively similar, and so they're really not taking up much of the foliar water. So why does this matter? Who besides mangrove people need to know about this? And what directions does this point us to in the future? So I have three small questions that I want to discuss a little bit today. And the first is that would using foliar water uptake be a competitive advantage for mangroves? Does this have to do with where they are in the world? The second is what can we learn about the future ecosystem services from this? So how do we utilize this to our advantage? And third, the true arts person in me wants to know what is our responsibility for the world of mangrove ecology, and is it our role in general to interfere with these ecosystems at all? So based on some previous research done by my mentor, Dr. Samantha Chapman, she found that over time, mangroves are moving. So they're going polewards, they're going north and south at the same time, and they're getting out of that tropical and subtropical latitude that I showed on that graph before. As you can see, there's some more mangrove in orange down along this side, right here especially, and down along the bottom. So this is interesting because mangroves are both limited by the tropical latitudes because it's warm, but especially because it's not cold. So when it doesn't freeze, the mangroves are able to survive. But when there are freeze events, they're limited to these latitudes. So as time goes on, I hope we can all agree that the climate is warming. If not, we can talk after. But with these infrequent freeze events, the mangroves are able to expand in their ranges a little bit more. They're not held back as much. So I want to know maybe this foliar water is an advantage in that expansion. So to answer the second two questions, what can we learn about the future of ecosystem services from this? There are some regions around the world who are starting to take advantage of these services like hurricane mitigation and the cost of coastal development and things like that, especially in Florida and in the Philippines. In Florida, they're looking at how we can stop coastal erosion, and in the Philippines, they're trying to plant mangroves to build up the seafloors of their lower-lying islands. And so that would combat sea level rise. More so than that, I want to know what is our role in the future of mangrove ecosystems, and I want to look into that a little bit more in the future because I want to know, as we're changing so many of these ecosystems, are we changing too much? Do we have too much of an influence? Is it our place in general to look around or to plant mangroves and things like that? So that is what I'm excited for in the future. In conclusion, just some takeaways from my research. Mangroves do utilize foliar water uptake that we found in our experiments. Not all mangroves behave the same way, which is something I'm really interested in. And this experiment has broader implications for policy development and climate change research. With that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth. That was really interesting. On behalf of Falvey Memorial Library and the Center for Research and Fellowships, I'd like to present to you with 2019 Falvey Scholar Award. Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. There you go. Perfect. Thank you.
So much.
Thank you. Okay, finally, our last scholars. I'd like to invite Dr. Anil Bamidai to introduce our last Falvey scholar.
Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Ritesh Karsalia. Ritesh has been a pleasure to have in my lab. He's not done with. He has to do still a few experiments. Semester is not complete. but Ritesh came to Villanova as a biology major and minoring in Spanish and Latin American studies. he entered Villanova as a BS, I would say BS MD student, with trying to finish up 3 years on campus and then go to Drexel for medical school. But at some point he realized, I would say 2 years into the undergraduate program, that classroom education was not enough, and he really needed to have a lab experiences. So he really changed a course, and this is a growing mindset that I kind of realized he has. Ritesh stayed back and has carried out his project on looking at a lymphocyte called as a T lymphocyte, and this is a little teaser for those of you who are looking at this big title, and so that you can stay back and listen to him. So he is involved, his research is involved, that he's going to present is on this membranes. Membranes are these barriers that every cell has that keeps away anything outside the cell and lets the cell to do itself, all biochemical reactions that happen inside, as well as genetic kind of information that it has to create inside the cell. At the same time, very selectively import things what it has to do. At the same time, it has certain proteins, certain what are called receptors that do a handshake with other cells and communicate with other cells. So Ritesh has been very much engaged in that kind of research in cell-cell communication, and that's what he's going to present. While he stayed back on campus, he's been very much involved in service to the community and to the Villanova community and outside Villanova as well. So he has been a community interpreter at the law school for Spanish interpreter. In fact, since he's a Spanish minor, he was a tutor for the biology, general biology students, and he was a tutor for English as a second language. He volunteered for that. All these volunteer kind of assignments that he has taken up. And this is really part of what Villanova is all about, service. I mean, I think, and he really owned it and has carried it through. I would say that Ritesh, although he has served the community, is a gym enthusiast and has taken to cooking recently. So which is he's serving himself well, and I think I never realized that he was into health and fitness in that really serious way. So Father Peter is not here. I think he introduced, he gave introductory remarks in the beginning. I would say if he was here, he would say, Ritesh, go break a leg.
Well, thank you for that really kind introduction. I hope you guys aren't too worn out by all of these presentations thus far, because we're going to embark on a scientific adventure here, and as my mentor sort of alluded to, I hope that you guys don't get intimidated by the name of my project. We're going to break it down and hopefully it doesn't remain too technical for everyone out here. So my project is called Investigating the Role of Ordered and Disordered Phases Within the Plasma Membrane of Primary CD4 Positive Helper T Lymphocytes. The cells can be seen here. The blue cell is the cell that we're going to be focusing on, and antigen-specific responses. So let's break that down a little bit. So the branch of the immune system that I have primarily been investigating and working with is called the adaptive immune system. And this is the branch of the immune system that comes into play whenever you hear about viruses, diseases, or some sort of cancer. This is the branch of the immune system that is notably very specific towards certain, pathogens. It's tightly regulated, so it's not, just sporadically acting up whenever it feels like it. It's diverse because it can cover a wide range of different pathogens, and it has a memory function. So when you get sick, you recover from that illness, and then if you get sick again, you might recover a little bit faster. And this is something that you see with vaccinations. Now, CD4 helper T cells are these cells highlighted by this red arrow here, and they are very important in orchestrating the responses carried out by the adaptive immune system. So the responses usually occur in a two-step process. The first step being seen here. And in this first step, you have an antigen-presenting cell, which you could almost think of it as like a police officer, right? This police officer, this cell is going to catch some sort of bad guy, whatever virus, pathogen is in your body, and it's going to put him in handcuffs. He's going to present this pathogen to the CD4 positive T cell, and the CD4 positive T cell in this analogy might be someone like a judge. The T cell is going to look at this antigen, say that, yes, this is a bad guy, we need to do something about him. So the first step of the process is the actual presentation of the antigen. Now, what my project specifically focuses on is this interaction between the two cells. As my mentor referred to it, it's almost like a handshake. It's a presentation, and there are a lot of proteins and receptors on the barriers of these cells that come into play in determining what happens next. So I mentioned that this is a two-step process, and the second step is the actual response that occurs. So once the T cell sees this bad guy, this pathogen, it's going to start secreting a bunch of proteins called cytokines to itself, and that's going to cause it to eventually proliferate. It's going to create clones of itself, and it's going to start signaling to other cells in the immune system and in the body that, hey, we need to do something about that. And that might result in either the production of antibodies, or it might result in the activation of other cells called cytotoxic T cells, which are going to go directly to these bad guys, these sites of infection, and kill whatever cells contain these bad guys. So as I mentioned before, my project mainly looks at that first part, right? That first step of that process, which is the interaction, the actual presentation, and the corresponding signaling that occurs. Now, this occurs at a region that is known as the immunological synapse. I have a pointer here. Yeah, I was like looking at it. I was like, why isn't it coming up? So the immunological synapse it's where this handshake occurs, right? It's that first part of that interaction that we were alluding to earlier. And so over here, what you see on this top diagram is that you have the CD4 positive T cell, and you have the antigen presenting cell. So you have the cop showing the bad guy, you have the judge who's going to decide what happens. And in this dynamic interface, you have a bunch of proteins, a lot of receptors on these barriers that are going to be important in making sure that this process is regulated. So the signaling that occurs between these cells it's mediated by this region that's called a lipid raft. And that's my particular area of interest. So it's the SARPA region here, which is sort of blown up here as well in the figure below it. And a lipid raft is essentially a nanodomain that is comprised of lipids, so the fats that you might think of, cholesterol, and a bunch of proteins. And it's very regulated, and it can be found in two different phases. So these lipid rafts could either be found in an ordered phase or a disordered phase. What you see in this figure over here is an example of the ordered phase. And in this ordered phase, all of the lipids and the cholesterol and all of these proteins are very tightly packed, and they're regulated, and there isn't a lot of space for a lot of fluidity or movement. So as you can see here, you have a lot of phospholipids. They're all compressed, they're all packed, and they're static in this current snapshot. However, there are other forms as well when you have less cholesterol, you have less phospholipids, and these phospholipids might be unsaturated. And in these cases, you have a lot more fluidity, and the responses that occur as a result of this disorder are different. So we've looked at previous investigation in our lab and among other scholarly work as well, and we've noticed that you can remove cholesterol from the membrane, cholesterol being one of those components of the ordered phase of the lipid raft, as I alluded to. And when you do so, you increase the disorder in the membrane and the protein dissociation from these regions. So if you remove cholesterol, if cholesterol somehow gets removed from the phospholipid membrane, you end up with a lot more disorder, and that results in downstream signaling processes that are different from what they would already be. And this is something that we can measure. So what you see in that diagram is just an example of how you could measure it, the order and the disorder of a membrane using a fancy machine called a flow cytometer, which costs tens of thousands of dollars in Mendel. And you could figure out how much order and disorder do I have within these cells, so you can then examine their properties. And a previous graduate student in our lab has induced disorder in these cell membranes by inserting a organic molecule called 7-keto-cholesterol. So this is the molecule here, and what this molecule, often abbreviated as 7-KC, does is that it creates disorder in the membrane. It causes a release of some cholesterol, and this has been noted to reduce the cellular proliferation that we've seen with the CD4 positive T cells. So again, as I was mentioning in that two-step model before, the first step is the actual signaling process, and the second step is the proliferation of these T cells, right? Once the cells determine that, hey, this is a bad guy, they start to produce a bunch of proteins, and they start to replicate. They start to clone themselves and turn into other proteins. Well, we've seen that when we induce this disorder, we insert this molecule into the membrane of the cell, and there is less order in these lipid rafts. We see that the second part, that expansion and that production of cytokines and proteins, is reduced. So now my hypothesis is really focused on the reversibility of this phenomenon that we observe and the mechanism through which it occurs. So the first hypothesis that I sort of had was that if we introduce cholesterol to reconstitute membrane order, we will reverse the reduction in the T cell proliferation decrease that we saw. So again, as one of the former students in our lab noticed, when we introduced that molecule 7-KC into the membrane, we saw that there was increased disorder and there was less proliferation. Well, my theory, or the hypothesis that I'm working on, is that, well, if we've increased disorder and we've seen that there's less proliferation, what if we try to recreate that order by reinserting that cholesterol that was removed? So if we reinsert that cholesterol after it's been removed, we're hypothesizing that we will see a reversal in this decrease in proliferation. And then the second hypothesis that we were examining was with the mechanism of this actual process. And so we looked at the expression of a protein called CD69, and we hypothesized that it will be downregulated in the T cells with increased membrane disorder. So what this figure over here sort of shows in another, I guess, representation is that handshake, that first step that we were talking about earlier. So you have the presentation of a pathogen, a bad guy, and what occurs are a bunch of signaling processes which ultimately result in the production of a protein called CD69. It's one of the earliest markers of T cell activation. And so we hypothesized that, well, if there's increased disorder going on this barrier somewhere, that there's a good chance that this protein might not be produced or it might not be expressed on the surface of the cells as much. And so that's what we were hoping to look at. Now, the actual model through which I did this was a little technical, but the overall gist of it was that we would take mice that were bred in the vivarium in Mendel Science Center, and we would dissect their lymph nodes out, and then those lymph nodes contain a lot of these lymphocytes, these immune cells. And so from that, we would be able to add these compounds. We would be able to add cholesterol if we wanted to reconstitute the order. We would be able to add 7-keto-cholesterol if we wanted to increase disorder. And so we could modify the order and disorder of these membranes, and then determine how much should they proliferate or expand, and then we could tag them for these markers and see, well, is this protein CD69 actually being expressed or not? And the results that we ultimately found thus far was that the decrease in CD4 positive T cell proliferation is actually reversible if we re-add cholesterol. So the two red arrow pairs that I've highlighted here sort of show that there are two different concentrations of 7-keto-cholesterol, but what you'll see in both is that on the left, on these two guys, you have no cholesterol added, so there's just a bunch of disorder in the membrane, and we're seeing that the cells aren't proliferating as much. That's why the bars are relatively lower. But on the right, when we add the cholesterol back in to reconstitute membrane order, we're seeing that that response is actually increasing back up pretty significantly. And then additionally, for the second hypothesis, looking at that protein CD69 to see whether if that was one of the mechanisms through which this process occurred, we saw that the CD69 protein is upregulated when there is a stimulatory antigen, but the order and disorder phenomena that we were observing does not seem to significantly be affected yet. So now it brings us to the future investigation and questions that we have, along with this. So we know that there are differences in downstream signaling responses with CD4 positive T cells that have increased membrane disorder. And now what we're going to look at is the other potential pathways through which this can be occurring. So we know that CD69 most likely, or from the current data that we have, isn't one of the mechanisms through which we see this decrease in proliferation. But as this really complex diagram might tell you, there are a bunch of different ways through which T cell signaling occurs. So I just looked at CD69 down here, and previous students in our lab have looked at a phenomenon called phosphorylation up here, and they've noticed that there aren't differences in the attachment of these little P groups to these proteins up here. But there are still other areas in this diagram, which is also very simplified, that can be explored as well. So there are other proteins or transcription factors that are produced that lead to the production of proteins that are involved in that second step of that immune response that we were talking about earlier. And then there are other intermediaries even in this first step, such as cellular calcium levels that we have yet to look at as well. And then the additional area of future investigation for our lab is understanding the individual contributions of the T cell and the antigen-presenting cell in this observed decrease in proliferation that we've occurred. So we know that we can, induce disorder by inserting that molecule 7-KC into the membranes of the immune cells, right? But we want to isolate that as well and see, well, what if we just insert 7-KC into the CD4 positive T cells, or just into the antigen-presenting cells, instead of, just taking the lymph nodes themselves, which contain both, and adding the compounding to it. So it's more of a minute causality experiment that we hope to pursue. And then now the immunological significance of this is that this allows for a modulation of a lot of the immune responses that our body can perform if we can control these ordered and disordered phases in the membrane. So we've talked about creating disorder in the cells, which decreases the proliferation, which is decreasing the immune response. Well, there are a lot of diseases out there, autoimmune diseases or allergic reactions, where your body is hypersensitive. It's reacting to these pathogens on levels above which it normally probably should. And so can we potentially regulate this and decrease it? Who knows? Maybe using this model we can. And similarly, if we need to bring back a proliferative response, we could do that by reconstituting that order. So there are a lot of potential medical applications to this process. And now finally, because we're all patrons of the library and advocates of scholarly information, I thought it'd be very nice to include a little bit about the importance of having access to information. So the library has always been a great resource in terms of getting access to a lot of scholarly journals. As someone in the field of science, as my previous peer had also probably experienced, that we have to look at a lot of previous investigation. That's the basis of all of our work, right? And so having access to so many journals through the library resources and having access to great librarians and reference sources. I mentioned Robin Dowles, who I believe is no longer here, but she was here for the last 3-4 years for me, was a great resource in terms of getting access to a lot of academic content. And one area in my project in which this played a pretty key role was in terms of procedural design. So one of the investigations that I mentioned before was determining the causality of the antigen-presenting cells and the T cells, and determining which one contributes more towards the decrease in proliferation that we've seen. And as part of this, we wanted to isolate these antigen-presenting cells from the lymph nodes. Well, the kit that you might easily find online that allows you to easily do this costs $1,000. And when you don't have a lot of funding from the department, or even with a VERF budget of $500, and you need a lot of materials, that's not really feasible a lot of the times. And so using these resources, we were able to find other previously published protocols. And although our lab hadn't necessarily used them, we were able to adapt them and create our own protocols based off of the information that we were able to find through the journals that our library provided. And so over here is sort of a technical representation of what we did instead, but the key takeaway there was instead of having to spend $1,000 and not being able to pursue this, we were able to run an experiment where we could take the bone marrow of mice and isolate the cells through a specific media, which cost only, I think it was $128 when I checked last week. We were able to do that for nearly a tenth of the price. So I thought that that was just a really cool way in which the library was, and the resources that the library has provided, was able to help us out. And with that, I leave you with a whole lot of citations, which again, the library has been grateful for. I've been grateful for, because if anyone is familiar with the software Zotero, it's used widely in the scientific community, at least from my understanding. And I had no idea that such a great tool existed until I went to a presentation for my VERF summer funding, and Robin was giving a talk on here's how you create all these citations, and you don't have to actually sit there and manually do everything. So again, thank you all.
I know we are a little bit running out of time, but if you have any question for Ritesh, do you have any? It was a little bit too complicated.
Technical, right?
But I'd like to acknowledge Ritesh. I really appreciate your comment. And I know the audience here knows how to use library resources, but he's absolutely right. We try to bring all the resources for our students and faculty and researchers. So, the best pleasure for library and librarians is that those resources are really fully used. And then I can thank you enough to you mentioning that. I really appreciate, but you gotta have your word. Okay. On behalf of Falvey Memorial Library and the Research for, Center for Research and Fellowships, I'd like to present you with 2019 Falvey Scholar Award. Congratulations, Ritesh. Great work.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Well, I think this is the end of our ceremony. I really like to thank everyone who attended, but particularly our 6 outstanding undergraduate scholars and their faculty mentors. I want to emphasize how much library try to support our research activities on campus and fostering the research spirit and the advancement on campus. So I really enjoyed this talk because it was absolutely much knowledge that I didn't know before I attended. And so thank you so much for your support for the library, and then enthusiasm and this, I can see this passion and enthusiasm on everybody's sparkling eyes. So I want to congratulating all of you, and thank you so much for attending this important event. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have